In the early summer of 1940, the unthinkable happened. A bastion of European power fell in a matter of weeks, leaving the world reeling. Was it doomed strategy, political miscalculation, or sheer German might? Join us in this epic journey through history as we reveal the untold stories of courage, betrayal, and desperate hope behind the fall of France. Buckle up, because this is the truth behind one of the greatest military shocks in modern warfare. Welcome, viewers, to our in-depth documentary on the fall of France in 1940. A pivotal event that reshaped the balance of power in World War II. Over the next 2 hours, we will journey across the battlefields of Northern Europe, peer inside the war rooms of anxious generals, and explore the personal trials of soldiers and civilians caught in a cataclysm they never anticipated. France was revered as a military powerhouse, fortified, experienced, and confident after the horrors of the First World War. But in just 6 weeks, the unrelenting German Blitzkrieg shattered centuries of French resilience. As we peel back the layers of this momentous collapse, we'll meet those who fought valiantly against overwhelming odds and examine the strategic choices that led to one of the swiftest major defeats in military history. We'll also look at the fateful decisions taken by Allied leaders in real time, as their illusions of security crumbled under the thunder of panzer divisions. Expect an immersive deep dive into top-secret plans, on-the-ground testimonies, and the human stories that paint a vivid picture of 1940 Europe. From the Maginot Line to the beaches of Dunkirk, from political negotiations to dramatic evacuations, you'll see how this single campaign forever changed the trajectory of the Second World War. If you're ready to explore the heartbreak, bravery, and brutal truth behind the fall of France, stay tuned. Our story begins now. The years following World War I were haunted by the specter of another continental war. In France, memories of trenches and chemical warfare fueled the creation of massive fortifications. The Maginot Line became a symbol of national security, a guarantee, or so it seemed, against the horrors of the last war ever repeating themselves. Yet, beneath this stoic exterior, political rifts and mounting uncertainty whispered a different story. Across the border, Germany under Adolf Hitler was rearming at breathtaking speed. National pride surged after the humiliations of the Versailles Treaty, and the Nazi regime set its sights on swift expansion. Meanwhile, Britain and France debated the merits of appeasement, each fearful of triggering a second global conflict they felt ill-prepared to face. In this tense pre-war climate, alliances were tested, and the echoes of conflict took on new resonance. The reoccupation of the Rhineland and the annexations that followed raised urgent questions. Would the Maginot Line and French strategy hold if Hitler pushed westward? Even as French industrial power and military tradition seemed formidable, a sense of complacency began to creep in. A complacency that would soon be shattered. Tonight, we embark on the steps that led to an epic downfall. We'll see how miscalculation and a reliance on dated strategies set the stage for a lightning war that caught Europe unprepared. As 1939 gave way to 1940, an uneasy lull settled over Western Europe. Dubbed the Phony War, this period witnessed minimal direct confrontation on the Western Front, while tensions simmered beneath the surface. Families in France stocked food and huddled around radios, anxiously tuning into any scrap of information. Politicians in Paris debated next steps, balancing patriotic fervor with fears of a massive conflict that could dwarf the last war. Germany, meanwhile, planned meticulously. Officials in Berlin studied the weaknesses in the Allied lines, and the strategy known as Blitzkrieg began to take concrete form. Rapid mechanized assaults aimed at disorienting and overwhelming enemy defenses. Key planners like General Heinz Guderian refined the concepts of fast-moving tank columns, close air support, and encirclement maneuvers. In the Allied capitals, conflicting opinions on how best to confront Hitler caused paralysis at the highest levels. Although France and Britain had declared war in September 1939, decisive action was scarce. Some believed that a blockade strategy would eventually bring Germany to its knees, while others stressed the need for immediate offensive operations. The public grew restless, uncertain whether the war would truly ignite or quietly defuse. What no one could deny, though, was that once the storm truly broke, it had the potential to reshape Europe and the world forever. On May 10, 1940, the quiet illusions of the Phony War were shattered. German forces struck with surgical precision. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg found themselves under sudden, ruthless assault. The dreaded Blitzkrieg was in motion. Tanks roared across frontiers, Luftwaffe bombers targeted airfields, and paratroopers seized strategic bridges. World War II in the West had truly begun. For France, the plan hinged on stopping the Germans at the Belgian frontier, relying on a replication of World War I's static warfare. The Maginot Line was deemed unbreakable, so the Allies concentrated on sending troops north, hoping to lock horns with the Germans in a predictable frontal struggle. But the German High Command had other ideas. In a daring maneuver through the dense Ardennes forest, previously dismissed by the Allies as impassable for heavy armor, panzer divisions advanced rapidly, outflanking the main Allied forces. Amid the chaos, French and British troops scrambled to establish defensive positions. Communications broke down under relentless German air raids. Town after town fell into German hands as panic spread along the front. Soldiers and civilians alike struggled to comprehend the speed of the German advance. The dreaded possibility that the famed Maginot Line could be bypassed altogether became an unsettling reality. In this explosive opening act, the fate of Western Europe hung on a razor's edge. Was the formidable French army truly prepared to face this new form of mechanized warfare? Or had the Allies underestimated a threat that would soon crash over them like a tidal wave? The city of Sedan became the focal point of Germany's masterstroke. In mid-May, panzer formations led by General Guderian smashed through French lines along the Meuse River. Within days, the vaunted defenses that had stood since World War I were rendered obsolete by the speed and coordination of the German assault. For the French, the shock was immeasurable. Commanders who had relied on a more methodical pace of battle were suddenly overwhelmed by a fluid, fast-moving enemy. Aerial bombardments wreaked havoc on morale. French troops, exhausted and often cut off from reinforcements, struggled to regroup. Communication lines snapped under the strain, leaving entire units uncertain of their orders. In the background, the French High Command frantically tried to patch holes in the lines, redeploying reserves that arrived too little, too late. The crossing at Sedan was a watershed moment. Once German armor had established a foothold, the Allies found themselves effectively split, with large contingents still committed to defending Belgium. Unbeknownst to many Allied leaders, the fate of the campaign might have been sealed by the events around this single strategic locale. Sedan underscored the lethal potential of Blitzkrieg. It wasn't just a military tactic, it was psychological warfare aimed at paralyzing and demoralizing the enemy. In late May 1940, the German armored spearhead had effectively cut off the bulk of the Allied armies in northern France. As the noose tightened, hundreds of thousands of British and French troops found themselves trapped near the Channel coast. What followed was a desperate race to consolidate a defensive perimeter around the port of Dunkirk. Sensing the gravity of the moment, the British launched Operation Dynamo, a massive evacuation plan. Warships, commercial vessels, and even small fishing boats braved constant attacks from the Luftwaffe to rescue stranded troops. On the beaches, soldiers queued in waist-deep water, praying for rescue while shells and bombs rained down. Despite the carnage, an astounding 338,000 Allied troops escaped, a miracle of deliverance in Winston Churchill's words. Though hailed as a heroic rescue, Dunkirk was also a painful admission of a lost battle in France. The entire northern flank had collapsed, leaving the heart of the country exposed. Morale in France suffered a devastating blow as rumors of German invincibility took hold. Meanwhile, Hitler's confidence soared. Surely, France's final defeat was now just a matter of time. Back in Britain, the evacuation inspired a new sense of determination, proving that not all was lost. But for the French still fighting on their home soil, the Dunkirk episode epitomized desperation. As the Allied troops withdrew, entire French villages lay at the mercy of the advancing Wehrmacht. The final act of the fall of France was hurtling ever closer. While chaos reigned on the front lines, political turmoil brewed in the corridors of power. In Paris, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud struggled to rally his cabinet. A sense of betrayal and confusion set in. How could France, with its massive army, be collapsing so rapidly? Ministers exchanged blame, with some accusing the high command of gross incompetence, while others argued that structural weaknesses dating back to the Treaty of Versailles were to blame. General Maxime Weygand replaced Maurice Gamelin as commander-in-chief in a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation. But the crisis ran deeper than leadership changes. Many believed that the colossal shock of modern warfare had simply outpaced French readiness. As refugees streamed southward, roads clogged with panicked civilians, further hindering the military's ability to redeploy. Despair mingled with dogged patriotism in the capital. Some argued for continued resistance, fighting street by street if necessary, while others quietly discussed an armistice. The fear of Paris becoming a second Verdun haunted official circles. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels with Britain were strained, as each side questioned the other's commitment to a fight that seemed to be spiraling out of control. This political backdrop sowed seeds of resentment and suspicion that would linger long after 1940. It also laid bare the fragility of alliances when confronted by a foe that seemed to defy conventional logic. France was nearing a tipping point, and decisions made in the next few days would determine the nation's fate. As June dawned, the reality of the French army's collapse became undeniable. Frontline units, already battered, faced new German advances. While some formations fought valiantly, others disintegrated under the punishing tempo of Blitzkrieg. Desertions increased amid low morale, and supply lines crumbled under the weight of continuous retreats. The Luftwaffe retained near-total air superiority, striking at will to disrupt French reinforcements. French tanks, though technologically capable, were often deployed piecemeal without cohesive command structures. Communication breakdowns led to entire regiments operating in isolation. In this maelstrom, heroism still shone. Small groups of French and colonial troops carried out last stands, buying precious time for civilians to flee. Amid these desperate battles, Germany's propaganda machine declared the French soldier obsolete, a relic of a bygone era. The psychological impact was immense, both on the troops fighting on the ground and the anxious government officials in Bordeaux, where the French government had relocated after Paris was deemed unsafe. Was this truly the end of France as a military power? Could a meaningful counterattack still be mounted? These final days of resistance were marked by heartbreak and stubborn courage. Communities volunteered in droves, building barricades and digging trenches. The French spirit remained, if only in pockets. And still, the German juggernaut pressed on, seemingly unstoppable. A crescendo of frantic last-ditch efforts would lead to a decision that would echo through history, the choice between a sacrificial stand and a negotiated peace. While France fought for its very survival, another blow struck from the south. On June 10, 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain, hoping to secure territorial gains while the French were on the brink. Mussolini's forces advanced over the Alps, though they met stiffer resistance than expected. For the French, this felt like the final betrayal. Not only were they reeling from the German onslaught, but now their southern flank demanded precious manpower and resources that were already stretched thin. In Parisian salons and among the rank and file, outrage intermingled with resignation. Had Italy entered the conflict earlier, the outcome might have been even more devastating, but the psychological blow alone was huge. France was quite literally encircled by enemies. On paper, Italy's attacks were limited, but symbolically, it underscored France's isolation in the face of monumental adversity. At the same time, Britain, having evacuated most of its forces at Dunkirk, offered moral support, yet provided few additional troops to stem the new southern tide. With every passing hour, the encirclement grew tighter, and options grew fewer. The stage was set for an inevitable climax, one that would reshape not just France, but the entire European theater. By mid-June, the unthinkable occurred. Paris, the city of light, stood on the verge of occupation. Already declared an open city to spare it from destruction, Paris fell to the advancing German forces on June 14th. It was a surreal moment. Residents awoke to the sight of Nazi banners draped across iconic boulevards. The once bustling cafes fell silent, and the city's spirit dimmed under the shadow of foreign occupation. Many Parisians, though fearful, tried to continue their daily routines, uncertain of what the future held. German soldiers paraded down the Champs-Élysées, capturing the moment in film and photographs that Hitler would later display as a trophy of his triumph. For the French government, now in Bordeaux, this was the final straw. France's heart had been taken, and with it, the illusions of a rallying defense. Though some pockets of the French army fought on in central and southern regions, the psychological impact of losing the capital was shattering. Across Europe, neutral observers gasped in disbelief. How could a nation that had valiantly resisted in the First World War now lie prone so quickly? The Nazi regime, fueled by victory euphoria, proclaimed that a new order in Europe was dawning. In that poignant moment, hope for liberation flickered yet did not die. The occupation of Paris would sow seeds of resistance, forging a clandestine network of rebels who dreamed of striking back. But for now, the fall of France appeared almost complete. In the wake of Paris's fall, the French government faced a stark choice: continue a seemingly hopeless fight or negotiate an armistice. Under Marshal Philippe Pétain, an aging hero from World War I, France signed an armistice with Germany on June 22, 1940. This agreement effectively split the country into two zones, the occupied zone in the north and the so-called free zone in the south, governed from the city of Vichy. The armistice terms were harsh. France had to bear the costs of the German occupation, effectively crippling its already battered economy. The French army was reduced to a nominal force, its weaponry largely confiscated. Millions of prisoners of war were shipped to Germany, while French sovereignty became, at best, a shadow. For many, Pétain's government in Vichy represented a humiliating collaboration, bending to Hitler's will in the hope of preserving some semblance of national identity. Others saw it as pragmatic. France needed to minimize further bloodshed and shield civilians from Germany's iron fist. But a vocal minority rejected surrender entirely, fleeing to Britain or slipping underground to form the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle. This dramatic political shift would reverberate throughout the war. The Vichy regime would collaborate with Nazi authorities, fueling resentment and sparking internal conflict among French citizens. Meanwhile, the seeds of the French resistance took root, promising that one day, the country would rise again to reclaim its honor and liberty. With the ink barely dry on the armistice, the human cost of the campaign became starkly evident. Casualties on both sides numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but for France, the blow was especially acute. Families were torn apart as POWs were led away. Refugees who had fled the fighting found their homes destroyed or occupied. In cities like Lille and Rouen, buildings lay in ruins, a testament to the destructive fury of modern warfare. For French colonial troops, the experience was often fraught with additional hardship. Some had traveled thousands of miles from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and beyond, only to find themselves in a collapsing front. Their sacrifice was no less significant, yet their stories rarely reached the front pages of newspapers. On top of the physical devastation, the psychological trauma loomed large. A once proud nation was forced into subservience, and the question of responsibility gnawed at the public consciousness. Soldiers who had fought valiantly harbored deep resentment toward politicians they believed had failed them. Civilians questioned the value of alliances and wondered if their sacrifices had been in vain. In the months that followed, rationing and forced labor in the occupied zone compounded the suffering. As people confronted the daily realities of life under Nazi rule, despair could have easily taken over. Yet amid the ashes, a quiet determination began to form. From tragedies often rise the sparks of defiance. The fall of France reverberated far beyond its borders, rattling Europe to its core. Neutral nations watched in alarm, fearing that Hitler's aggression might soon turn their way. Spain, Switzerland, and others mobilized defensively, uncertain how far the Nazi tide would roll. Britain now stood virtually alone in Western Europe, prompting Winston Churchill to brace his nation for a potential German invasion. The United States, still clinging to neutrality, took notice. Although President Franklin D. Roosevelt had gradually shifted American public opinion against the Axis powers, isolationist currents ran deep. Yet the speed and ferocity of France's collapse injected urgency into Allied discussions with Washington. The question was no longer if the US would become involved, but when. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Soviet Union calculated its own moves, recently having signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Even so, the rapid German successes unsettled Soviet leadership, who began to fortify their western borders. The stage was set for a broader, more devastating conflict that would draw in nations from across the globe. The fall of France was more than just a national tragedy, it was a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape. A new order, dictated by Nazi Germany, emerged with frightening clarity, and each global power scrambled to adapt before it was too late. In every conquest, there are those who refuse to submit. Even as France signed the armistice, voices of dissent found their way onto the airwaves, urging countrymen not to abandon hope. Foremost among them was General Charles de Gaulle, who issued his famous appeal of June 18 from London, calling on the French to continue fighting. At home, small resistance networks began to form, gathering intelligence, sabotaging infrastructure, and passing crucial information to the British. They ranged from communist cells in major cities to rural maquisards in remote forests, united by a common purpose: liberation. In the shadows, clandestine newspapers circulated, and coded messages were broadcast on the BBC, offering both moral support and practical guidance. The Vichy regime condemned these dissidents as traitors, but their numbers grew. Men and women of all classes risked their lives. Some paid the ultimate price in Nazi reprisals. Yet each act of defiance was a spark, lighting the path toward eventual Allied landings and liberation. This spirit of resistance would mature into a formidable underground army that played an instrumental role in the eventual downfall of the Nazi occupation. But in 1940, these patriots were few and scattered, driven by faith in a free France that existed only in memory and in hope. This invisible war of sabotage and secrecy was every bit as crucial as the battles waged on open fields. It kept alive the flame of French pride, fueling a future fight for redemption. In the aftermath of capitulation, life in occupied France settled into a harsh rhythm of daily survival. German soldiers patrolled city streets, while propaganda posters in French exhorted cooperation. Food and fuel became scarce, and the black market thrived. Curfews restricted movement, suspicion and fear poisoned communities. In some cases, everyday routines continued, schools remained open, and cafes served customers, but under the constant watch of German authorities. Identity checks were frequent, and arrests for suspected subversion escalated. For Jewish citizens, life became even more perilous as anti-Semitic policies, enforced by both Nazi and Vichy officials, took root. In the so-called Free Zone, Vichy's authoritarian policies blurred the line between autonomy and collaboration. Political dissidents were silenced, and the regime sought to remake French society under the banner of travail, famille, patrie, work, family, fatherland. But illusions of freedom shattered whenever German influence was felt, which was often. The psychology of occupation manifested in countless ways: neighbors turning on neighbors, quiet acts of defiance, or open shows of loyalty to Vichy. The moral dilemmas were profound. Some sought to shield loved ones by appeasing the occupiers, while others risked everything to uphold the dignity of resistance. Through it all, the memory of a once proud republic loomed large, fueling a complex blend of shame, resentment, and unbreakable resilience. In the grand tapestry of World War II, the fall of France is a cautionary tale of overconfidence, outdated strategies, and missed opportunities for collective security. Yet it also illuminates unyielding human spirit. Whether in the desperate defense along the Meuse or the courageous rescue at Dunkirk, ordinary men and women rose to challenges few could have imagined. The collapse reshaped the war, galvanizing Britain to stand alone against the Axis. It accelerated the United States' path toward intervention. It laid the groundwork for a complex occupation that would sow seeds of resistance, culminating in the eventual Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944. Lessons learned from France's downfall influenced future military doctrines, particularly the importance of air superiority, mobile armor divisions, and the synergy of combined arms tactics. For France itself, 1940 was a year of heartbreak. Occupation and the Vichy regime ushered in a dark chapter that tested national identity and values. Yet from this crucible of suffering emerged a renewed sense of unity and determination. The men and women of the resistance, the exiled leaders in London, and the countless everyday heroes who endured daily oppression kept the flame of freedom alive. When liberation finally came in 1944, it bore the weight of long years of anguish, but it also sparked an era of rebuilding and reconciliation. In looking back at the fall of France, we honor the sacrifices made, acknowledge the lessons learned, and remember that even in the darkest hour, resilience and hope can light the path toward a better future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most staggering military defeats and the human drama that underpinned it. The fall of France in 1940 was more than a swift campaign. It was a seismic event that reshaped alliances, strategies, and the very soul of a nation. If this exploration left you with insights, or even more questions, about the nature of war, power, and resilience, then we've accomplished our mission. As you reflect on the lessons of 1940, remember that history is not merely about dates and battles. It's about people, soldiers, civilians, leaders, and ordinary citizens, whose choices ripple across generations. May their stories remind us of our collective responsibility to remain vigilant, united, and ever mindful that freedom is never guaranteed but must be safeguarded by each new generation. Stay tuned for more in-depth historical explorations. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for future episodes. Until next time, this is your host, thanking you for watching and for keeping history alive.